We didn't ask for a war. We didn't plan for one. But when they executed a journalist on camera in broad daylight in front of his own family and then posted it online like a trophy, the decision made itself. This is what happens when silence stops being an option. At approximately 6:47 in the evening, a 27-year-old reporter named Miguel Davila was gunned down inside a small printing shop in the port city of Veracruz, Mexico. 32 rounds were fired into his body. The killers wore no masks. They carried GoPro cameras strapped to their tactical vests. They coordinated the hit over encrypted radio channels like a military platoon executing a sanctioned operation. And when it was over, the footage was uploaded to social media before the ambulance even arrived. Miguel Davila had been covering cartel violence, police corruption, and missing persons cases in the Veracruz Gulf corridor for a small independent news outlet he ran from his phone. He had 23,000 followers. He wasn't famous, he wasn't powerful, but he was honest. And in the territory controlled by the CJNG cartel, honesty is a death sentence. Within 72 hours of his murder, the United States and Mexico jointly announced the activation of a bilateral emergency security operation unlike anything seen in the modern history of the drug war. The operation was given a classified designation. The public would never hear its real name. But inside federal buildings from Washington to Mexico City, it was known by its internal file header, Operation Veracruz Thunder. And what followed was not diplomacy. It was not negotiation. It was the systematic dismantling of a cartel empire that had been allowed to grow for over a decade under the protection of corrupt politicians, compromised law enforcement, and purchased silence. More than 900 federal agents across 2 nations were mobilized. Over 400 arrest warrants were executed. 47 tons of narcotics were seized. And the political infrastructure that had shielded the CJNG's Gulf operations was ripped apart, piece by piece, name by name, badge by badge. This is that story, and it goes deeper than you think. Before we get to the raids, you need to understand what Miguel Davila uncovered in the weeks before his death, because the cartel didn't kill him for what he had already published. They killed him for what he was about to publish. In his final weeks alive, Miguel had been quietly assembling a database. Sources inside the Veracruz Port Authority, dock workers who handled shipping containers under armed supervision, had been feeding him manifests. Not the official ones filed with customs, the real ones. The ones that showed what was actually inside containers marked as agricultural equipment, ceramic tile, and frozen seafood. Fentanyl precursors from Asia. Pressed fentanyl pills by the millions. Cocaine bricks stacked like construction material. Methamphetamine in industrial quantities, vacuum-sealed and hidden inside hollowed-out machinery. Miguel had traced the logistics chain from the port of Veracruz to a network of warehouses in Tamaulipas, then north through Nuevo Laredo and into the Texas border corridor. He had names, shipping company names, Shell Corporation registration numbers, and he had one name that changed everything. A name he had circled in red ink on a paper notebook he kept hidden in his mother's house because he didn't trust digital storage. That name belonged to a fictional man we will call Governor Arturo Renteria, the sitting governor of Veracruz State in this story. And according to Miguel's sources, Renteria wasn't just turning a blind eye to the CJNG's operations, he was directing them. Miguel never got to publish his findings, but federal investigators on both sides of the border already had him on their radar, not as a suspect, as a source. And when his murder was broadcast to the world in that 35-second execution video, the intelligence agencies that had been quietly building their own case realized their window was closing. If the cartel was bold enough to execute a journalist on camera, they were preparing to lock down the entire region. It was now or never. 4:32 in the morning, Veracruz City. The Gulf air hung heavy and wet, thick with salt and diesel fumes drifting off the port. Streetlights cast orange circles on empty pavement. Stray dogs moved through alleys. The city was asleep. But above the rooftops, if you listened carefully, you could hear it. A low, rhythmic pulse. Helicopter rotors. Not one, not two. 7 Black Hawk helicopters moved in formation from the south, running dark, no navigation lights, barely visible against the overcast sky. On the ground, a coordinated convoy of armored SUVs and tactical vehicles rolled through predetermined routes that had been mapped for weeks using satellite imagery and undercover surveillance. FBI. DEA, ICE, Mexican Marines. Federal ministerial police units that had been pre-vetted and isolated from local command structures to prevent leaks. Over 300 agents moved simultaneously toward 19 targets across the Veracruz metropolitan area. The first breach happened at a waterfront warehouse registered to a seafood export company called Golfo Azul Internacional. On paper, Golfo Azul shipped frozen shrimp and octopus to distributors in Houston and New Orleans. In reality, it was the CJNG's primary narcotics packaging and distribution hub for the entire Gulf Corridor. SWAT teams hit the rolling steel doors with breaching charges at 4:33 a.m. Flashbang grenades detonated inside. The concussion shattered fluorescent light tubes and sent workers scattering. Agents in black tactical gear poured through the smoke. Inside, they found what intelligence had predicted, but what still stunned even the veteran operators. 1,400 kilograms of cocaine in vacuum-sealed bricks stacked on pallets. Over 2.1 million pressed fentanyl pills in labeled cardboard boxes, sorted by color and dosage like pharmaceutical inventory. 47 kilograms of crystal methamphetamine. 19 semi-automatic rifles, 11 handguns, and cash. Stacks and stacks of U.S. currency bundled with rubber bands and sorted into duffel bags, totaling what would later be counted as $11.4 million. But the warehouse wasn't the revelation. The revelation was in the back office. Behind a false wall concealed by stacked pallets, agents discovered a climate-controlled server room. Inside were 6 enterprise-grade encrypted servers, a satellite uplink terminal, and a wall-mounted monitor displaying real-time GPS tracking of 37 vehicles. Those vehicles, investigators would later confirm, were the CJNG's active drug transport fleet currently operating on both sides of the border. And connected to the main server was a single encrypted laptop bearing a digital signature that would eventually be traced through 3 layers of proxy authentication to a secure government network registered to the Executive Office of Governor Arturo Renteria. At the same moment the warehouse was being secured, DEA and ICE teams hit a second target 4 kilometers away, a sprawling ranch-style compound behind concrete walls topped with razor wire, hidden at the end of a dirt road in the industrial outskirts. This was the CJNG's regional command center. The breach was violent. Armed guards opened fire from the rooftop. Agents returned fire. The exchange lasted 90 seconds. 3 cartel gunmen were killed. 2 more surrendered after flashbang grenades were deployed into the main structure. Inside, agents found a different kind of horror. 17 undocumented migrants, including 4 minors, locked in a basement room with no ventilation and a single bucket for a toilet. They had been held there for 11 days, waiting to be transported north as part of a human trafficking pipeline that used the narcotics convoy routes as cover. The migrants were dehydrated, terrified, and several showed signs of physical abuse. Federal paramedics were called immediately. Each of those 17 people had paid between $8,000 and $12,000 to be smuggled into the United States. The CJNG collected the fees up front. If the migrants couldn't pay the full amount, they were forced into labor, or worse, upon arrival. This wasn't a side operation. This was a revenue stream worth tens of millions annually. Simultaneously, a third team breached a luxury condo tower in Boca del Rio, the upscale coastal district adjacent to Veracruz City. The target was the 14th floor penthouse belonging to a man identified as Raúl el Ingeniero Montoya, the CJNG's chief logistics coordinator for the Gulf region. Montoya was captured in his bed at 4:41 a.m. He did not resist. On his nightstand sat a satellite phone containing recent call logs to numbers in Jalisco, Sinaloa, Guatemala, and Brownsville, Texas. In his home office, agents found hard copies of shipping manifests matching the ones Miguel Davila had been collecting from Port Authority sources. The same documents, the same routes, the same shell companies. Miguel had been right about everything, and it had cost him his life. By 6 a.m., the first phase of Operation Veracruz Thunder had secured all 19 targets. 41 individuals were in federal custody. The seizure totals from that single night would eventually be finalized at over 3 tons of mixed narcotics, $22 million in cash, 67 firearms, and the most significant digital intelligence haul in the history of U.S.-Mexico joint counter-narcotics operations. But the operation was just beginning. At 9:15 that morning, inside a secure facility at the U.S. Embassy Annex in Mexico City, a joint cyber forensics team began processing the servers and devices recovered from the Veracruz raids. FBI digital analysts worked alongside Mexican intelligence specialists in a clean room filled with monitors, signal isolation hardware, and enough processing power to crack military-grade encryption. The CJNG had used a sophisticated layered encryption system to protect their communications and financial records. It took the team 11 hours to break the first layer. What they found underneath changed the scope of the entire investigation. The servers contained a master operational blueprint, a single unified document, hundreds of pages long, detailing every aspect of the CJNG's Gulf Corridor operations. It was internally codenamed Proyecto Marejada, Project Surge, and it was not a drug trafficking plan. It was a state capture plan. Proyecto Marejada outlined a systematic, multi-year strategy to gain functional control over the entire state of Veracruz through a combination of political corruption, law enforcement infiltration, economic manipulation, and targeted violence against journalists and civic leaders. The plan identified by name over 200 individuals across government, law enforcement, the judiciary, and the media who had been recruited, bribed, blackmailed, or threatened into cooperation. It detailed the specific monthly payments made to each one. Police commanders receiving $40,000 per month to redirect patrols away from cartel convoy routes. Judges receiving lump sum payments of $200,000 to dismiss trafficking cases. Port Authority officials receiving percentage-based commissions on every container that passed through customs uninspected. And at the very top of the organizational chart, connected to every major decision node by a single red line, was the codename El Arquitecto, the architect. And the digital signature trail, the encrypted authorization keys, the secure communication logs, all of it pointed to one person: Governor Arturo Renteria. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. Renteria hadn't been bribed by the CJNG. He had been installed by them. His gubernatorial campaign had been financed through a web of shell companies that traced back to CJNG financial controllers in Jalisco. His key appointments, his police chief, his attorney general, his port authority director, had all been pre-selected by cartel leadership. Veracruz hadn't been infiltrated. It had been engineered from the top down as a narco-state within a state. A fortress designed to funnel drugs north and money south with the full cooperation of every institution that was supposed to prevent exactly that. And the plan was not finished. The final chapter of Proyecto Marejada, the section that made seasoned intelligence analysts go quiet when they read it, outlined Phase 4, permanent integration. The CJNG intended to use Veracruz as a proof of concept. If they could achieve total state capture in one of Mexico's largest and most strategically important states, they planned to replicate the model across Tamaulipas, Tabasco, Oaxaca, and eventually into U.S. border regions through corrupted local officials in Texas and along the Gulf Coast. They weren't just running drugs, they were building a parallel government, and they were winning. The second phase of Operation Veracruz Thunder launched at 4 a.m. the following morning, but this time, the scale was different. A joint command center had been established at a Mexican naval base south of Veracruz City. Inside, a wall of screens displayed a digital operations map covering not just Veracruz, but Tamaulipas, Puebla, Oaxaca, and the Texas-Mexico border corridor from Brownsville to Laredo. 63 red target markers pulsed across the map. Each one represented a confirmed node in the CJNG's Proyecto Marejada network. Over 900 agents were deployed across both countries: FBI, DEA, ICE, DHS, Homeland Security Investigations, Mexican Marines, Mexican Naval Intelligence, and specialized SWAT units from 4 U.S. field offices. Air support included 12 helicopters and 2 U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft, monitoring Gulf shipping lanes for cartel vessels attempting to flee or redirect cargo. U.S. Army assets were positioned along the Texas border in a support and interdiction capacity. The raids hit like a wave breaking across 1,000 miles of coastline. In Tamaulipas, DEA teams struck a methamphetamine superlab hidden inside an abandoned textile factory outside Ciudad Victoria. The lab was producing an estimated 400 kilograms of crystal meth per week. Chemical tanks, industrial mixers, ventilation systems. It was a factory in every sense of the word. 14 lab workers were detained. In Brownsville, Texas, ICE and FBI agents simultaneously raided a chain of used car dealerships that had been identified through financial analysis as the CJNG's primary money laundering front in the U.S. border zone. The dealerships bought vehicles at auction, marked them up on paper to create artificial revenue, and funneled the profits through a series of bank accounts that eventually reached offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands and Panama. Total laundered funds estimated at over $170 million over 5 years. In Puebla, Mexican Marines hit a ranch compound that served as a transit point for human trafficking operations. 31 migrants were recovered alive from a series of underground holding cells. In the hills outside Jalapa, SWAT teams breached a fortified mansion belonging to a senior CJNG lieutenant known as El Halcón. The estate contained an arsenal of over 200 weapons, including anti-materiel rifles, fragmentation grenades, and body armor. A drug tunnel originating beneath the property extended 400 meters to a concealed exit point near a highway on-ramp used by northbound cargo trucks. And in Veracruz City itself, at 5:17 a.m., federal agents arrived at the private residence of Governor Arturo Renteria. He was arrested without incident in his pajamas, while his security detail, which had been pre-neutralized through coordinated interception, watched helplessly from the back of federal vehicles. In the hours that followed, his police chief was arrested at his office. His attorney general was detained at the airport attempting to board a private flight to Guatemala. His port authority director was pulled from a yacht anchored 3 miles offshore. One by one, the pillars of the cartel's captured state fell. By sundown on the second day, Operation Veracruz Thunder had executed raids across 63 locations in 5 Mexican states and 3 U.S. states. 412 individuals were in custody. 47 tons of narcotics had been seized, including an additional 8 million fentanyl pills discovered in a warehouse in Tamaulipas that had been disguised as a frozen food distribution center. Firearms seized totaled over 700. Cash and assets frozen exceeded $300 million. The CJNG's Gulf Corridor network, which had taken a decade to build, suffered more damage in 48 hours than it had in the previous 10 years combined. But the hardest truth was still waiting inside the data. As federal analysts continued to process the intelligence from Proyecto Marejada in the days that followed, a devastating picture emerged of just how deeply The CJNG had infiltrated the institutions meant to protect the public. In Veracruz state alone, 114 law enforcement officers across municipal, state, and federal levels were identified as active cartel assets. Not suspects, confirmed assets, with documented payment records, communication logs, and operational assignments. Patrol sergeants had been paid to create gaps in highway coverage during scheduled drug convoy movements. Their shifts were arranged not by their commanders, but by cartel logistics coordinators who sent instructions through encrypted messaging apps. Border checkpoint supervisors had been given specific vehicle plate numbers to wave through without inspection, timed to the minute. Raid schedules had been leaked to cartel leadership in advance. On at least 7 documented occasions, planned federal operations had been compromised by internal leaks that allowed targets to flee hours before agents arrived. 23 officers were arrested in the first 72 hours. Among them were 2 deputy police chiefs, a state investigative commander, and a senior intelligence analyst who had been passing real-time federal surveillance data directly to El Halcon's network for over 3 years. An honest DEA liaison who had worked the Veracruz corridor for 6 years sat in a debriefing room and said something that captured the feeling of every clean officer who had spent years working beside people they thought were allies. He said there were times he would plan an operation for weeks, execute it perfectly, and arrive at the target to find it cleaned out, emptied hours before. He thought it was bad luck. He thought it was coincidence. Now he knew it was his own people selling him out. What they had uncovered wasn't just corruption. It was a parallel enforcement system, a shadow police force that wore the same uniforms, carried the same badges, and answered to a completely different chain of command. The CJNG hadn't corrupted law enforcement in Veracruz. They had replaced it. And the reach didn't stop at Veracruz. Proyecto Marejada's logistics maps showed narcotics distribution routes extending from the Gulf Coast through Texas into Louisiana, across to Georgia, and up through the Carolinas to the eastern seaboard. Trucking contractors operating under legitimate Department of Transportation registrations were hauling narcotics in modified trailers with hidden compartments. Way stations along key interstate corridors had been identified in the plan as managed checkpoints, stations where CJNG connected officials ensured that specific trucks passed through during maintenance windows or shift changes when scrutiny was lowest. Agricultural shipping routes through the Rio Grande Valley were used to move fentanyl precursors disguised as fertilizer components. Shell nonprofit organizations filed for federal grants related to migrant assistance programs and used the funds to finance safe houses and smuggling corridors. The network could move an estimated 12 tons of narcotics per week across the border without triggering a single automated alert. 12 tons every week. And it had been operating at that capacity for at least 3 years. The final file recovered from the Proyecto Marejada servers was labeled simply Fase Final, Final Phase. It outlined the CJNG's vision for Veracruz not as a temporary operating base, but as a permanent, self-sustaining cartel headquarters embedded within the legitimate structures of state government. Tax revenue would be redirected through compliant officials to fund cartel infrastructure. Public contracts for roads, ports, and utilities would be awarded to cartel-controlled companies. Education budgets would be hollowed out to prevent civic development. And journalists, the last line of defense between information and darkness, would be systematically eliminated or silenced until no independent voice remained in the state. Miguel Davila's murder wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was step 47 in a 100-step plan to erase the truth from an entire region. His name was literally in the document, marked for elimination, along with 11 other journalists who were still alive when the servers were seized. Those 11 were immediately placed under federal protection. Let that settle for a moment. The system wasn't broken. It had been redesigned, rebuilt from the inside by people who swore oaths to protect it and then sold it to the highest bidder. Veracruz was not a state with a cartel problem. It was a cartel with a state disguise. So here is where we are. Governor Arturo Renteria sits in a federal detention facility, facing charges that span narcotics trafficking, corruption, conspiracy, accessory to murder, human trafficking, and money laundering across international borders. His attorney general, his police chief, his port authority director, and dozens of officials appointed under his administration face similar charges. Over 400 cartel operatives and collaborators are in custody across 2 countries. 47 tons of drugs that would have reached American streets, American schools, American homes, will never arrive. The fentanyl alone, those millions of pills, each one capable of killing a human being with a dose smaller than a grain of sand, represented enough poison to end hundreds of thousands of lives. But Miguel Davila is still dead. He is still gone. He was 27 years old. He ran a small news page because he believed people deserved to know what was happening in their own neighborhoods. He asked for help. He asked for protection. He got neither. And his killers filmed his death like it was content. This story, fictional as it is, reflects something that is terrifyingly real. Across Mexico, journalists are murdered for telling the truth. Communities are strangled by criminal organizations that operate with impunity, and the corruption that enables it doesn't always come with a gun. Sometimes it comes with a handshake, a campaign donation, and a smile at a press conference. Power doesn't always need open violence. Sometimes it only needs silence and ambition. A governor who looks the other way, a police chief who adjusts a patrol route, a judge who delays a hearing, a port official who doesn't inspect a container. Silence, repeated across 1,000 small decisions, builds an empire more effectively than any bullet ever could. The cost of that silence is measured in lives. In the teenager in Ohio who takes a fentanyl pill at a party and never wakes up. In the family in Veracruz who finds their door kicked in at midnight. In the mother in Texas who buries her son and is told by authorities that the drugs came from nowhere and the investigation is ongoing. In a 27-year-old reporter who just wanted to tell the truth and was executed for it in front of the counter where he grew up helping his parents. If you are still here, if you watched this far, share this story. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers. Share it because silence is how they win. Every time someone speaks, every time someone refuses to look away, the architecture of impunity cracks a little more. This was a fictional dramatization, but the crisis it reflects is real. The names were invented. The pain is not. And if you think this is the last story like this, you're wrong. Because somewhere, right now, in a place most of us will never see, another journalist is weighing the same impossible choice Miguel Davila faced. Tell the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and let the darkness grow. What would you choose?